The Falcons might need to fill the void left by James Pearce, and their best option might be Arnold Ebiketie.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Locked On Falcons, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the number one sports podcast network in all of the galaxy. And if you do not know me, I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we will be talking about the Falcons' potential to replace James Pearce Jr.'s on-field production. And we'll look at some internal and external options. We'll touch upon the topic of the volatility of sacks, and we'll rant about a surprise candidate that seems to be growing in popularity as a potential QB option that we did not talk about on yesterday's episode when we talked about QB buckets. But first, let's talk about the Falcons' need to enhance their pass rush because James Pearce Jr.'s future is now in doubt. And we're going to continue, as I said on yesterday's episode, to continue to focus on the on-field football aspect of it, although obviously the off-field stuff with his arrest and potential suspension could be on the horizon. As I said on Sunday's episode when we broke that stuff down, I don't think it's a guarantee that James Pearce Jr. won't suit up for the Falcons in 2026, likening it to the Rashee Rice situation where he's had an off-field incident in 2024, played in 2024, and only got suspended in 2025, but we shall see. But obviously, I think we all can agree that the Falcons cannot operate with the assumption that James Pearce Jr. will play this upcoming season. They need to plan accordingly. They need to plan on him not playing and adjust. And I think, that plan in terms of planning accordingly could start with, retaining several of their internal free agents. Later in today's episode, we'll talk about some of the external options, at least at the top of the market at that point. But, internally, Arnold Ebiketie, Leonard Floyd are both impending free agents. And as we discussed on the edge rusher breakdown last week when we went through the entire defensive position group, we sort of surmised, and obviously this was before James Pearce's off-field incident, but we sort of surmised that Arnold Ebiketie was pretty much as good as gone. And at least Leonard Floyd, there was at least a decent chance that Leonard Floyd would sign a 1-year deal to stay in Atlanta because basically Leonard Floyd has been signing a series of 1-year deals as basically a mercenary pass rusher for the last 3 or 4 off seasons. And Atlanta is as good a bet as any of those to offer him one of those. But AK probably was not going to be back based off of, some tweets that he had around the trade deadline that suggested that he wanted to get traded and did not get traded. And as we discussed in that episode, he kind of took that as a sign of disrespect and played his butt off to basically go out there and prove to the world that, he can be a force, even if he's, sort of lost in the shuffle for the Falcons pass rush. I think it's maybe worthwhile for the Falcons to try to retain Arnold Ebiketie just based off of how he finished the season. Can they make him an offer that he can't refuse in that regard, given that it seems like, he had basically shut the door on coming back by giving him offering him a multi-year lucrative contract or something along those lines, something in that $10 to $15 million a year range to sort of be the number 2 opposite Jalen Walker instead of James Pearce, who we don't know and can't be relied upon to sort of fill those shoes. And I know for a lot of folks, they kind of say no, I wouldn't do that. And it's easy, I think, to be dismissive of Arnold Ebiketie based off of the lack of sack production. He had last year only 2 sacks this past season. But as we discussed in that edge breakdown, AK had extremely high pressure rates, especially in the last half of the season. And from week 9 on, he had a higher pressure rate than Micah Parsons and Will Anderson, who were basically 1, 2, or 2 and 3 among edge rushers in terms of pressure rate this past season. And later we'll get into the conversation about sack volatility and why I'm not down on Arnold Ebiketie for not having sacks despite that high pressure rate, because later when we talk about sack volatility, we'll talk about how consistent pressure rates are compared to sack production. But, I do feel like in a lot of ways, looking at the numbers, like, you contrast how well Arnold Ebiketie did in terms of generating pressure in the second half of the season and contrast that how poorly he did in the first half of the season, because Pro Football Focus only gave him credit for 3 pressures in the first 8 games of the season for a 5% pressure rate, which I think was like the worst of any edge rusher in the league during that span of time. And I don't think that's a accurate portrayal of, or I think he was winning more. I know I certainly counted more than 3 pressures in the first 8 games when watching the film myself. But, it gets to the conversation that we heard Ian Cunningham talk about when he was asked about his philosophy, which is draft, develop, and retain, when he did his introductory presser last week. And I'll be curious if that philosophy applies to all the Falcons players, or will it apply to just his picks, right? We know that general managers tend to think, as most human beings do, tend to think like, oh, the choices that I make are the right choices, and the choices that somebody else made are the wrong choices. And, on today's episode, basically, you will get a similar vibe from me, where it's like my opinion is the only opinion that matters, and everybody else's opinion is just bad and wrong, right? So that's just human nature when it comes to that. But I do wonder if Ian is going to apply that same draft, develop, and retain philosophy, which is, what it sounds like. You draft players, you develop those players, and then you retain those players. And that's going to give you sustainable success, your ability to, and essentially, if you have guys that are good enough to be retained, that means you're drafting and developing guys successfully. And so you're checking all those boxes. Is, checks and balances, so to speak, I guess. Or it's, what is it? It's a feedback loop. That's what it is. Yes, that's the word I was trying to, and so, will that apply to Terry's picks, right? Because a number of those guys are coming up on contracts, and like, yeah, it's easy to sit here and go like, yeah, we'll retain Bijan Robinson and Drake London, but some of the guys on Arnold Ebiketie and Matthew Bergeron and Zach Harrison and Kyle Pitts, that is going to be something that's interesting. So, I think the conversation around AK is going to be interesting, because I think depending on who you ask, if you ask me, I think AK is kind of underrated. I think probably to the vast majority of people listening to this podcast, they would probably say he's overrated. And I think some of that is attached to the hype and expectations we talked about when we drafted him, that he has, 10 sack potential. He never delivered on that. And I understand why Falcon fans in particular, because of the last 2 decades of not having sack production. And basically, when we draft another pass rusher that doesn't deliver on sacks, it's kind of like, oh, well, he's just another guy that disappointed here in Atlanta, that didn't do the thing that we all want him to do, which is help us get out of the basement in terms of delivering sacks. And I think that's a big reason why people were so, high on James Pearce after the rookie season that he had, and sort of so down and disappointed, in addition to the off-field stuff. But it's like, oh, we finally got one, and then of course this would happen. Woe is me, we are cursed as as a franchise, all that sort of stuff. So I get why that comes from, but I do think, like, when you compare Arnold Ebiketie, especially compared to his draft class, that 2022 draft class, like, he's outperformed several of those guys, even if you don't look at him at face value as a big, success or anything like that. Like, he has a higher career pressure rate than Jermaine Johnson, Trayvon Walker, and Kayvon Thibodeau, all of whom were drafted in the first round. He has less sacks than Walker and Thibodeau do, but at least on a per snap basis, right? Because part of it is, those guys have played like 1,500 snaps, and AK's played less than 1,000. But on a per snap basis, AK's sack to snap ratio is much higher than those 2 guys plus Jermaine Johnson. And so based off of that, I do think like AK is somewhat underrated, because I think he's kind of, he's one of the top 5 to 6. I think it was the 6th edge taken in that draft class. And I think he's comfortably performed like one of the 5 or 6 guys. So he, I wouldn't say he's been like this home run of a draft pick, but he's sort of like, at the very least, has met expectations. And in my opinion, I think you can make a pretty easy argument that he's exceeded expectations based off of his production here in Atlanta, even if it hasn't quite lived up to, the true ceiling that we all hoped and wanted him to have. And I'm not going to sit here and say that, like, on his second contract, he's going to start racking up 10 sacks or anything like that. But, he'll probably still be that 6 to 8 sack guy that he's been predominantly over the last 4 seasons. But, like, I'm not turning my nose up at that moving forward, because, as any Falcon fan could tell you, those guys, while those guys aren't going to get the hype from this fan base, it hasn't been easy finding those types of players, and letting one walk out the door is maybe not, conducive to long-term success. So, I feel like AK can firmly be considered like what a Terry Fontenot double looks like, alongside guys like potentially Zach Harris and Matthew Bergeron. And so I'm certainly probably open to an AK reunion. I'm curious if any of you guys are more open. I'm sure many of you are much more open today than you maybe were a week ago. So we'll see if the Falcons decide to go down that road, but it's not necessarily completely up to them, because obviously Arnold Ebiketie has a choice if he wants to stay in Atlanta or not. And the vibe I get is the answer is no. So that may mean that the Falcons may not have their best internal option, and instead may have to seek external options. And we'll talk about some of the top free agents, as well as get into a conversation about that sack volatility as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So hiring isn't easy. You often find someone who looks good on paper and then find out later they're not quite the right fit. And if you just had Indeed sponsored jobs, today's sponsor, you would be able to find the right fit much easier. If you're hiring, Indeed is all you need. So stop struggling to get your job post seen on other websites. Indeed sponsored jobs is going to put your post at the top of the page and help you reach the right candidates faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed are 90% more likely to report a hire than non-sponsored jobs. So spend more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with less stress, less time, and more results using Indeed sponsored jobs. And you can get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job that premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL. Just go to Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, do it the right way with Indeed. So continuing today's Locked On Falcons, I want to thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this podcast. You are the reason why Locked On is the #1 sports podcast network in all of the galaxy. And you can level up your everydayerness by joining the Everydayer Club, where you can get some special perks like an ad-free version of the podcast, some Locked On merch, as well as get exclusive Locked On Podcast Network Discord access. And of course, you can join the Everydayer Club and see what other perks you can get by hitting that link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. It's just $5 a month or $50 a year, so go check it out. So when we look at the external options, and this is not meant to be a comprehensive breakdown, again, we have plenty of time to get into some of that as we get closer to free agency, as we sort of get a better picture of the Falcons roster and what this draft class looks like, and sort of comparing and contrasting it to some of the top free agents. But I was looking at ESPN's top 50 free agent rankings, and that included 9 edge rushers: Trey Hendrickson, Jaelan Phillips, Odafe Oweh, John Franklin Myers, Khalil Mack, K'Lavon Chaisson, Boye Mafe, Joey Bosa, and Kwity Paye. And, I think Hendrickson and Phillips are the two sort of headliners of this class. And obviously, it feels like old hat talking about the possibility of the Falcons signing Trey Hendrickson on this podcast, as we spent a good amount of time talking about a potential Trey Hendrickson trade last offseason. The challenge with Trey Hendrickson is the latest rumors are that the Bengals might tag him, put the franchise tag on him, and he's age 31. So even if even if the Falcons did decide to go after Trey Hendrickson as their James Pearce replacement, that's really only a short-term solution to that problem. But certainly if you can get the sack production that Trey Hendrickson has been well famous for over the last 5 years, even for one season, that would be a huge boost for this pass rush. And then Jaelan Phillips is kind of the younger up-and-coming guy. The main knock against Jaelan Phillips is twofold: the injury history, and he doesn't get a ton of sacks, right? We'll circle back to that notion of sacks production in a second, but he really had a great 2025 season, contract year boost, all that sort of dump. He was in Miami early in the season, got traded to the Eagles, had a 19% pressure rate in Miami, and then had a 19% pressure rate in Philadelphia. And again, going back to what we said earlier, that put his pressure rate as among, I think, was top 5 in the NFL, right behind Will Anderson, Nick Bonito, Micah Parsons, and oddly enough, Jadeveon Clowney. That to me tells me that Phillips is a guy that can, be an important pressure guy. But the question, of course, is sack production. Now, the other two names that we'll just mention briefly of those top 9 guys, just because they have connections with this current coaching staff, and we know that a through line over the last 5 years under Terry Fontenot has been signing players and adding players that have coaching connections. We'll see if that trend continues under Ian Cunningham. But John Franklin Myers played for Jeff Ulbrich in New York for several years, brings a similar skill set as Zach Harrison. And most recently was in Denver. And you've heard me talk about how they're trading the Jets, that is trading John Franklin Myers to Denver 2 years ago, was a big contributing factor to why that Jets defense, as good as it had been the 2 previous years, kind of took a big step back in 2024. But Kwity Paye is another one where he played under Nate Ollie in Indianapolis. So it'll be interesting to see if there's maybe a potential reunion for some of those guys here in Atlanta. But obviously a big part of James Pearce's value to the Falcons, as we mentioned earlier, was his sack production. And the main concern you're going to have if you don't have James Pearce this year is losing that sack production. And we'll talk a little bit about sack volatility, but we'll talk a little bit about some of these free agents is sack conversion rates, right? And that's looking at your sacks divided by your pressures, which is basically the percentage of pressures that result in sacks. And the NFL average for edge rushers is about 15%. And James Pearce Jr.'s in 2025 was 23.3%, which is a very high number, right? And basically that means that an average pass rusher with about 45 pressures that JPJ had would generate between about 6.5 to 7 sacks. And so the question, of course, is, was that a fluke, right? And you can probably go back and look at, those 10.5 sacks of JPJ's and find like 3 or 4 where it's like, you padding your stats a little bit, JPJ. And again, that's not a knock against JPJ. It comes with the territory. But like I immediately, I think of that Daniel Jones sack strip that he had in against the Colts, where it was a screen pass, and Daniel Jones, instead of dirting the ball like you're supposed to do when the screen isn't open, because they don't block guys, and JPJ was able to come free and get a sack on that particular play. It was a great play, but it's like, those types of plays, it's like, that's not supposed to be what happens. But when you look at some of these other 9 guys and their sack conversion rates, Trey Hendrickson has the highest one, which is 20. And looking at it specifically with these guys, because there's sort of volatility of sacks year to year, it's like, okay, well, that's a 1-year number. Would it come back down to earth? So I looked at all 9 of these guys and their sack conversion rates over the last 3 years combined to sort of see if this is a consistent trend where these guys can convert above average or below average numbers. And Hendrickson was the top of this group with a sack conversion rate of 21%. Kwity Paye was right after him at 20%. Khalil Mack was 16. Bosa was 16. Owe was 15. Jaelan was 15. Franklin Myers was 13. Mafe was 12. And Jaelan Phillips was actually the lowest of this group at just under 12% as well. By the way, if you're curious for Leonard Floyd's sack conversion rate this past or over the same period of time, it was 19%. And Arnold Ebiketie is about that league average of 15%. So this gets us to a conversation about sack volatility and why we tend to value pressures a lot on this podcast, because it tends to be a little bit more predictive. And we can take one of these players, and Boye Mafe, as a good example of this, and just look at the last 3 years, right? In 23, he had 9 sacks. His sack conversion rate that year was 16%. 24, that dipped to 6 sacks. Sack conversion rate of 13%. And then in 2025, he only had 2 sacks this past season, and his sack conversion rate dipped to 5%. And I think you can basically say with an average of about 12% over the last 3 years, that 5% is a dip in that, and that's probably going to bounce back. But when you look at Mafe's pressure rates over that period of time, it was like 14%, 13%, and 14%. And so again, that's just a good illustration of the sort of volatility of sacks year to year versus the pressures, which is pretty consistent year to year. That's not going to change typically for developed pass rushers. Obviously, as guys develop in the league, you can go from like 9% to 12% to 14%. But once you hit sort of what you are, that's going to usually hover within a few percentage points year to year, while that sack number can go up and down from year to year. And Mafe is a good example of that number going up and down. And so I think when we talk about these external options, I think the Falcons would absolutely be justified in investing significant resources in an edge in the event of James Pearce's departure from Atlanta. And whether that's a free agent or using a premium draft pick, I think they would be justified in either way. Obviously, I think for us as Falcon fans, it's been a conversation we've had about other positions where problem areas of the roster, it's like once we make progress, once we make strides, take strides and make progress, can't talk as usual on this podcast, you don't want to sort of take steps back in some of these areas from a roster standpoint. And I think we all would agree we do not want to go back to a world where the Falcons are having like 20, 25 sacks or whatever those numbers. And it's like, okay, if we regress this year from 57 to 42 sacks, like I don't think anybody's going to be sitting here complaining that much about. But if we're regressing from 57 sacks to like 29 sacks, it's like, oh boy, we're having real problems. And so as we sit here, James Pearce moving forward, regardless of what the NFL and the Falcons decide his fate is going to be, he's going to be an unreliable option for this team moving forward just because of the off-field concerns, regardless of what happens to him on the field. And so they can't really count on him in their future plans. And so they should move forward with that in mind. And if he does wind up redeeming himself and becoming a more reliable option for the Falcons, then okay, well, the downside of that is now if you go out there and invest the resources to find a replacement for him, now you have 3 good edge rushers, counting Jalen Walker, instead of 2. And even a 5-year-old can do that math where it's like, okay, that actually is better for the Atlanta Falcons. So we'll probably do a deeper dive on some of these edge rushers and revisit them as we get closer to free agency in March. But that's just kind of a general overview of touching upon this conversation. But we'll wrap up today's episode, changing subjects and revisiting the quarterback conversation and talk a little bit about some of the suggestions that you guys gave me for, renaming one of those buckets, as well as going on a mini rant about Zach Wilson, of all people, who seems to be a quasi-popular option for the Falcons in terms of the quarterback position. And we'll break that down to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So the winter games are officially here. And if you're anything like me, you're locking in for the events that you only get to see on the biggest stage every 4 years. It's the Olympics, so the drama and the intensity is going to be there. And it's why we follow the Winter Olympics on FanDuel. From medal counts to individual events, finding your angle on the sports that you care about most, FanDuel is going to give you more ways to stay connection to all of the action, whether you're an expert on curling, speed skating, hockey, or some other winter sport. We all love a biathlon, right? Or, you're like me and you're just like, I don't really know what's going on in these sports, but I do enjoy watching them. Even niche events become must-watch when you're fully locked into the competition. And FanDuel can help you stay locked into the competition, whether you want to bet on your home country or you just love an underdog story. They're going to keep you involved in the entire Olympics experience and keep it engaging from start to finish. So with the Winter Games on, there's no better way to follow them than with FanDuel. Just visit FanDuel.com and FanDuel, play your game. So if you missed yesterday's episode, we talked about 3 buckets in which nearly every quarterback, we'll see if we can find a 4th bucket for some of these guys, but nearly every quarterback option for the Falcons that they could add this offseason fit in one of those buckets. And it was basically the blue chip, the bridge, and the backup. And so, I love a naming convention. And basically I was like, I don't really love the blue chip name because it doesn't accurately describe, none of these guys are blue chip quarterbacks. And so I basically put it to some of you guys to suggest some alternative names that start with a B so that we can, we love alliteration here on the podcast. So that we can come up with a better name. And some of you guys suggested a couple that stood out to me. One person said the best available, and that's probably a more accurate description of it. It just doesn't roll off the tongue as readily. Some person said better than nothing, which is probably also an accurate assessment of that group. It's like, it's fine, but it's like it's his best options available. And then the other one that I think sounds good, but also probably oversells that group is the bona fide bucket. And so again, I welcome your feedback if any of those jump out to you instead of blue chip bucket. But those are some of the feedback I got from you guys. So if you're curious exactly what we're talking about, please go back and check out yesterday's episode to get more context on that. But one of the things that, scrolling through the comments on yesterday's episode that I noticed was a lot of people mentioned Zach Wilson as a potential option for the Falcons. And I had heard a couple of Falcon fans prior to this last couple of days talk about Zach Wilson as an option, like 3 of them. And I was just like, oh, that's just 3 weirdos that don't know what they're talking about. And then to see like 5 comments on yesterday's video. And again, it's a total of 8, so it doesn't seem like a big deal. But like to me, like that's that's 8 more people talking about Zach Wilson than I thought. And I tend to think, and maybe this comes off as condescending, but I tend to think that, my everydayers are a cut above the sort of average casual Falcon fan. Nothing wrong with that. But like if 8 everydayers are suggesting Zach Wilson, then it's probably like 800, casuals, as we like to refer to them condescendingly here on the podcast, that are also pushing for Zach Wilson. And maybe this is just picking up steam because Sam Darnold won the Super Bowl. And that's going to be one of the downsides of this offseason is every quarterback is going to somehow, could he be the next Sam Darnold? And I'm going to go out on a limb, as I sort of suggested this on the post-Super Bowl recap episode. We've seen Sam Darnold win this year. Nick Foles won like 7 years ago. And like this may be probably just a thing where a quote unquote bad quarterback, and again, calling these guys bad quarterbacks is certainly a stretch, but sort of a non-traditionally top-end quarterback winning a Super Bowl, again, that may just be a trend that we see every 7-8 years where the fates decide like, okay, well, we've had enough of the Patrick Mahomeses and the Tom Brady's. Let's get one for the little guy. And I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to basically say, like, I don't think there's going to be another Sam Darnold. And so this entire offseason conversation about who's going to be the next Sam Darnold is probably moot. That doesn't mean I don't think there can be, more successful reclamation projects. But in terms of like actually taking a team to the Super Bowl, like that ain't happening, guys. Maybe it happens in 7 or 8 years, but like that ain't happening anytime soon. And so like really when we're talking about reclamation projects, or at least when I'm talking about reclamation projects, it's just like, can I get like above average quarterback play from somebody that we were counting out, years ago? And Zach Wilson, to me, is not one of those quarterbacks that you're going to hear me advocating getting above average quarterback play. And I think probably I got to believe it has to do everything with the fact that Zach Wilson was a second overall pick for the Jets, just like Sam Darnold was a second overall pick for the Jets. And then that's the level of depth that people are applying to it or whatever. That's the only thing, because like the minute you spent more than like 3 seconds there's no way you're sitting here, advocating for Zach Wilson. Now, as we talked on that Super Bowl recap episode, there are sort of boxes that typically successful reclamation projects check, right? We mentioned the 50 plus starts, right? It seems like every successful reclamation project has started 50 plus games in the NFL before they flipped that switch. Zach Wilson's only started 33 games. Zach Wilson lost his job to Tim Boyle at one point and has spent the last 2 seasons away from New York as a third stringer. And I think a lot of it is just because people are like, oh, well, the Jets are so awful. And like, you can't count anything against them. But I look at it like this. The fact that, Sam Darnold was never really a third stringer in the NFL. He only really spent 1 year as a second stringer in the NFL, that 1 year in San Francisco. And again, I don't think it's a coincidence that the 1 year he spent as a backup quarterback, he learned arguably the best offense in the NFL and sort of like figured out, oh, like this is what, like that to me was a necessary component of Sam Darnold's reclamation. But, one of the things that stood out about Zach Wilson in New York is he took a lot of sacks. And like he couldn't run an offense. Like that was the thing that was most memorable of Zach Wilson, especially his rookie year when I was paying much more attention to him than I was in subsequent years, because eventually you just write a guy off and like, oh, he's not good. But like I remember very vividly his rookie season, especially where like he could not run an offense. And it was like the only time he looked decent was when he would go off structure because he just didn't understand what he was seeing. And I remember that being still an issue when he replaced Aaron Rodgers in 2023 to the point that it wasn't good enough and he got benched for Tim freaking Boyle, man. Like, what are we doing here, guys? But like, it's gonna be funny to me because like Justin Fields is one of those quarterbacks that at least checks some of the boxes of a reclamation project. And I want to make it clear, I am not going to come on this podcast and advocate for the Falcons to sign Justin Fields, but at least in theory, you can make at least a decent argument that Justin Fields can give you at least something close to average play, right? Because Justin Fields also takes a lot of sacks, but at least Justin Fields has the theory of offsetting that and also struggles to run in an NFL offense when it comes to like poor processing. But at least Justin Fields, in theory, can offset those negatives with a few positives because of his ability to push the ball down the field vertically with his big arm, as well as the fact that he can also take off and run and bust a 40-yard run on any given play. And so the idea of Justin Fields is basically the good and the bad can kind of cancel each other out so that you get something close to average play in the right environment, like we saw kind of in Pittsburgh. Like that can win games, right? If you have the right team around him, a good defense, a good offensive line, weapons, and a run game, like you can probably win games with Justin Fields, right? Again, not advocating for Justin Fields, but like to me, the only reason that you would advocate, or I would advocate, I can't speak for the rest of you guys, is just because if he gets cut by the Jets, you can sign Justin Fields and he's not going to ruin your comp picks in 2027. So you can sign him and not have to worry about what you're paying him ruining your comp picks and canceling out some third or fourth round pick that you're going to get from letting Tyler Algier or Arnold Ebiketie or Kyle Pitts or whoever or Caden Ellis walk in free agency this year, so that you're not ruining that. That's really the only argument I would make for signing Justin Fields. And so like when you're looking at the quarterbacks that could get cut, like Geno Smith, Jacoby Brissett, and Justin Fields, he's at the bottom of that list. But if you can't get a Geno Smith, can't get a Jacoby Brissett, maybe you settle for Justin Fields in that regard. That's the only case for him. There's no real argument for Zach Wilson because you're taking a bunch of sacks in Zach Wilson. He's not processing the football. And where's the upside with that? Where's the thing that's counterbalancing all those negatives? And I say that because like Zach Wilson had a pressure to sack ratio of like 24% during his 3 years in New York. That's really bad. Anything basically above 20 is bad, right? And anything close to 25, 30% makes you like the worst quarterback in the NFL when it comes to taking sacks, right? Negative plays. Like, and a lot of that is process. And Justin Fields also had a ridiculously high pressure to sack rate, at various points throughout his career. There have been seasons where he has been at around 20 or slightly under that number, but he also took a lot of sacks throughout his NFL career. But again, you have the upside. The knock on Zach Wilson is that hasn't changed, right? Because he hasn't gotten the reps over the last 2 years in Miami and Denver to think that he's gotten improved. And when you do look at the reps he has had over the last 2 years, which has been basically preseason reps because he's gotten only a handful of garbage time snaps in the regular season, his pressure to sack ratio in both summers in the preseason was over 30%. And you can say, okay, well, that's playing behind, third string offensive lines or whatever. But it's like the main problem with him hasn't been fixed. And so this idea that people are like, let's get Zach Wilson is just like so wild to me. And it's just like, again, it's just like this is why I sit here, not to get political on this podcast, but we need universal health care so that people can get therapy, as well as people can get free access to rehab. Because if you're out here pushing for Zach Wilson, like you are either a crazy person or you're on drugs. That's basically what I'm going to sit here and say. So that's where we're going to end today's episode. We will be back with more talking about the coaching changes that the Falcons have made and sort of the retention of their defensive coaching staff. But two sort of important pieces of their coaching staff, and Jerry Gray and Mike Rutenberg, are still up for grabs. So that will be your next Locked On Falcons episode. So make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss that. Check out Locked On NFL for the latest around the NFL. And of course, check out the Everydayer Club at the link in the description below. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.